Okay, so today is just kind of a more general, just responding to common pro-choice arguments. So we're going to talk about 3 or 4, depending on how long I go, and then jump into Q&A. And so the first argument I want to talk about, this one's pretty basic, but again, if you want to take notes, feel free to grab a pad of paper and a pen, or be typing, because I'm going to teach you a couple, or I'll just kind of give you a couple of bullet points in all of these. But one of them is the idea that some women are too poor to care for a child. We need abortion because women are going through tough circumstances. And sometimes they bring up poverty. Sometimes the idea is that she's in school and it's going to really mess up her education if she has a baby right now, or it's going to mess up her career. There's like a lot of different circumstance related arguments. I'll focus on poverty because I think I hear that one the most often. And this is a case where we know that the pro-choice person is making a mistake that we need to try to help them with, which is that they're actually committing a logical fallacy here. They're begging the question, which means that they're assuming their conclusion to be true. Because as I said yesterday, one of the big disagreements between pro-life and pro-choice people is whether or not the unborn is a valuable person or not. So when someone says, well, we need abortion because some women are so poor, you know, they're just assuming their position to be right, because they would not say that about toddlers. They would not say we need to sometimes kill toddlers who are persons because some women are so poor. They have in their head, oh, well, we know that the unborn is just a blob of tissue or something like that, something less than a person. And so then they just kind of add this emotional idea or circumstance and call it a day. So here's what we don't want to do as pro-lifers, because remember, from the first time, DBW, don't be weird. We don't want to be the weird, obnoxious, off-putting pro-life person. The off-putting thing to do here is just to accuse them of committing a logical fallacy. No one likes that. It's super obnoxious. Do you know you just committed the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy? I did that one time. I'm admitting I've screwed this up too before. I did that. I shouldn't have, but I did it. And instead, try to help them to see the problem without even naming the fallacy or telling them they committed a fallacy. And if you want to learn more about that, I've got 2 articles that Liberty will add to the list. That both have logical fallacy in the title, but there was kind of a series. I know, get ready, I told you to write notes. Get the phone out. But one of them was don't call logical fallacies by name, and I think one of them was like, you might not know what a logical fallacy is. Something like that. So don't do that. Instead, we want to help them in as nice a way as possible to help them to see this problem that's happening. So this is a more advanced move, because it's super easy to point out logical fallacies and like memorize the list and just like, oh, you just did this. It's harder to like, it's like you got to tie your hands behind your back. Like, can you help them figure it out without naming it? So it's like we're all getting more advanced here. So what we're going to do here is something that like pretty much every pro-life apologist calls trotting out a toddler. We are going to compare their argument to killing a toddler to hopefully help them to see this problem. At ERI, we have our own 4-step process for how to do this. So if you're taking notes, here's what you want to write down. Step 1, we're going to affirm their concern. We are going to affirm their concern. This is the common ground step. And you cannot do this in like one sentence. It's not enough. You need to take several sentences, maybe a minute or 2, and really explain why you have common ground. You can't just say, I agree, poverty sucks, and then move on. It's not enough. They don't believe it. You got to be like, man, I'm with you. There are a lot of people who are in deep poverty, and they're barely making it paycheck to paycheck. And then suddenly a baby is here, and that is just like threatening everything to them. They don't know how they're going to possibly make it because they're barely hanging by a thread right now. Completely life-changing. And maybe they're in a multi-generation cycle of poverty. And all of us agree, like we just want that to be broken. We want the cycle to be broken. We don't want people living in poverty. And we could have a whole discussion about like what kinds of things that like our government and our society could do to try to minimize poverty. And there's a lot of different views on that, and that would be an interesting discussion. So we agree that poverty is really bad. I'm with you. And then I'm going to do step 2. Brace them for the weird question. Brace them for the weird question. I'm going to say something like, let me ask you a question. This might sound kind of weird. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I'm about to do a thought experiment. I'm about to do this comparison. And sometimes I think pro-life people make the mistake of just moving through this process too quickly, and we kind of lose the person that we're talking to. Like I've seen pro-lifers where like the pro-choice person's like, we need abortion because of poverty. And the pro-life person says, imagine I have a toddler here. It's like too fast, too fast. The pro-choice person's like, what? I thought we were talking about fetuses. Why are you talking about toddlers now? What's happening? They don't know where you're going. You know where you're going, but they don't know where you're going. It's confusing. And so the reason that I added this step to our process was like, I just want to optimize the chances that this works. And also people are not as good, I think, at tracking thought experiments these days because of all the confirmation bias and closed-mindedness. So again, we're just optimizing the chances and just kind of setting them up. Okay, go with me here. I think this will help you understand where I'm coming from. Let's see. And then I'm going to do step 3, which is to create a parallel situation. Create a parallel situation. This is where you make the thought experiment. And you're going to want to base it on what they said. So you're going to do something different for every pro-choice argument. And you might even tell a story. But you're going to say something like, imagine a family that has a lot of kids and they're really, really poor. They're barely making it. And then as you know, some evening, the parents, after the kids go to bed, are trying to figure out how to make the budget work, and they just cannot zero it out at the end, Dave Ramsey style. And then finally, the husband looks at the mom and says, I don't know how we're going to do it, babe. I guess we're going to have to off the youngest one. And like they smother the 2-year-old in his bed that night. Like we all agree this is wrong, right? I've created a parallel situation. I've killed a toddler for a budget reason. Now, here's another quick little pro-life mistake not to make. Don't ask people in like a really curious way, do you think it would be wrong to kill the toddler in that situation? Like almost everyone agrees. Like basically everyone agrees. So don't be like, are you a bad person? Like that's basically the subtext of that question. No, just be like, so obviously we all agree that would be really wrong, right? But I'm trying to figure out why. Why exactly would it be wrong to kill the toddler to solve the budget problem? And see how they respond. And probably then you're going to do step 4, which is to describe your logic. Describe your logic. So it's the ABCD method. You're going to affirm their concern, brace them for the weird question, create a parallel situation, and then describe your logic. This is the hardest step, I think, for a lot of pro-life people. Because at ERI, we don't teach people to use sound bites very often. I want you to have a real, authentic conversation. And I think the most persuasive way to talk to, especially young people, as I said before, is kind of putting your cards face up on the table. Which means not just a sound bite. It's kind of explaining, this is the part where you're going to pull the curtain back. Here's the man behind the curtain. Here's what's going on. So it's probably going to sound like a paragraph. So with me, a lot of times it sounds like this. So here's what's going on for me. When you said we need abortion because of poverty, 2 things happened in my mind simultaneously. The first thing that happened was I was reminded that I'm sad about people in poverty. That was a good reminder for me. I really don't want that to happen. And then 2, I asked myself if that would be a good reason to kill a toddler. Because part of what's going on for me, a big part of what's going on for me, is I think that a human embryo and a human toddler are the same morally. One's bigger, one's more developed. I just don't think that matters. I think they're morally the same kind of thing. And so to me, it's only going to justify killing the unborn if it also would justify killing the toddler. And so I asked myself, well, would that be a good reason? Like, what about the really worst case scenario there? And I just like, I don't get there. I don't think we can kill toddlers to solve budget problems. We got to come up with some kind of a different solution. And so that's why I'm not instantly pro-choice. Even like you and I both agree that poverty is really bad. Like that's not where we're disagreeing. I think where we're disagreeing is I think that human embryos are persons, and I think that you don't, which makes sense. No, most pro-choice people don't think that. I get it, but I think that's the reason we're disagreeing. And it's why I'm not instantly pro-choice as soon as you use the word poverty. So come back at me. Help me understand where you think I might be wrong. And I'm going to invite them to counter my argument, and they're probably going to say, oh yeah, well, I don't think human embryos are valuable. Okay, cool. And now we've taken a conversation that used to be off track and we're on track now. We're talking about one of those two big disagreements. And now I'm going to use the equal rights argument and walk them through that process and help them hopefully to become pro-life. Because at that point in our conversations, that's when we see people become pro-life a lot of times, is once they really understand the equal rights argument. Okay, now let's talk about maybe the most common pro-choice argument. Women should be able to do what they want with their bodies. So this is where we're getting into that second disagreement a little bit. And frankly, it's going to be hard for me to talk about this because I do whole like hour-long lectures on this. Like there's so much here. And I'm going to try to just get through a couple of the most important points to kind of be as helpful as possible in a short amount of time. And I'll point you to more resources. But the first of three things I want to say about this is, one, I want you to just at least understand bodily rights arguments, because this is where I think a lot of pro-life people fail. A lot of pro-life people hear bodily autonomy arguments where they say, you know, it's totally dependent on her body, and, or, you know, she should have the right to do what she wants with her body, or women shouldn't be forced to be, you know, life preservers for other people and things like that. And a lot of times pro-life people hear that and we, in our head, get it confused. We misunderstand it and we think that they're saying it's not a person because it's so dependent or because it's in this location, it's inside of her body. And I think most of the time when people say this, they're not talking about whether it's a person or not. They're saying even if it is a person, she should have the right to kill it because it would be a big government overreach to control what women do with their bodies. Like that's a step too far. And so we should kind of give people their bodily autonomy. And, you know, even if it's a person, the problem is the person's inside our body, so it makes this really complicated. In my view, this is the foundational reason people are pro-choice. I don't think the most important reason people are pro-choice to them, most important to them, is that they think the unborn is not a person. I think that's there for most people. So most people, I think, have a dual argument going on. They don't think it's a person, but they have a bodily rights safety net underneath it. I think of a hammock that they could just like fall into, even if you change their mind with the equal rights argument. And it makes sense to me because, frankly, I don't think pro-life people tend to be that persuasive on the bodily rights arguments. I think we're getting a lot better on personhood, and bodily rights arguments, I think we fail often. And so understand the way the argument works, even if they're not saying it very clearly, as I said, they're super unclear, but the way the argument functions is they're conceding personhood. They're saying, like, let's say you're right, pro-lifers, about the baby being not only human, but a person, a valuable person. I still think she should have the right to an abortion because of this other thing. And you've got to track with that. So two of the most powerful responses to this argument of many. The first thing that I think works no matter, and there's kind of multiple kinds of bodily rights arguments. I'm not going to get into that for time, but there's multiple kinds. The first thing I'm going to say, no matter what argument they make, is I'm going to point out that their argument is necessarily an extremist argument. So we have an article on this that Liberty is going to link to called Bodily Rights Arguments Necessitate Extremism. It's one of the, I think, the most important articles on our blog, where we talk about how most pro-choice people that we talk to on college campuses, we can find common ground, as I said a couple of days ago. They usually think that late-term abortions are wrong, probably even so wrong they got to be illegal. They think sex-selective abortion is wrong. They think flippant abortions are wrong. It's a lot of common ground. But if the way, this is going to get a little philosophical, so like track with me on this. If the way that they're grounding their pro-choice view is that women should be able to do what they want with their bodies, then you don't get to take away any abortions. All abortions are now ought to be legal under that view. Even if maybe some of them are immoral, they should all be legal because women should have the right to do whatever they want with their body, right? So I'll give you a quick story of how this can play out. And this is kind of the thing that happened that led to that article that you're going to read, where we were at Aquinas College in Michigan. I was at our pool table. We had this table set up. Should abortion remain legal? It had a yes sign and a no sign and an it depends sign. And we're trying to bait people basically to come over and talk to us and have conversations. And this woman walks up very confidently. She started the conversation super chill by basically yelling at me, "Why do you want to control women's bodies?" It was super chill, super fun. And I was like, okay. And so I said, all right, I will answer that question, but can I ask you a quick question first? I like to find common ground. And she's like, fine. Okay. Said, are you for abortions through all 9 months or just like first trimester or something? She's like, oh no, I think we should draw the line at about 20 weeks. I said, okay, that's a pretty common view. Do you think that there are any reasons that women shouldn't be able to have abortions? And she said, well, I don't like it if women have birth control abortions. And that's like a pro-life phrase. It's like an awkward pro-life phrase. I didn't call it that. She was like, I don't like birth control abortions. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. And it's like, okay. So then let me ask you one more question. And I said, I'm not trying to make fun of you, but I'm just trying to figure out, why do you want to control women's bodies? And she said, what? And I said, well, you said, right? You think that late-term abortions should be against the law. You said that women shouldn't be able to have flippant, like birth control type abortions. And I'm just wondering why you want to control women's bodies. And she said, I don't. And I said, I don't either. It's so much more complicated than that. Can we like rise above bumper sticker slogans? Like I can do that too. I can be like, why do you want to kill all the babies? Like, but like, I don't think either of these techniques is going to help us have a real conversation. So can we kind of drop the rhetoric? Let's have a real conversation. I want to talk to the real you. She's like, okay. So she kind of like drops her guard a little bit. She's going well. And she's like, well, I just feel like women should be able to do whatever they want with their bodies. And I said, okay, I hear that all the time. I'm tracking with you. I think that's one of the most common pro-choice views. But here's your problem in my view. I think basically you're at odds with yourself at this point. Your argument disagrees with itself because you don't think that late-term abortions ought to be legal. As, by the way, most pro-choice people are with you on that. Of course, 9-month abortions should be illegal. But if your reasoning is women should be able to do whatever they want with their bodies, then you can't take away other women's right to have a 9-month abortion because it's still in her body. Now, pause the story. At this point, one of two things usually happens. Most of the time, they see the problem and they abandon bodily rights arguments altogether. And they jump to like a personhood argument or maybe something about why it shouldn't be illegal, like back alley abortions or something like that. It's very effective at that because young people do not want to be seen as extremists. And so if you kind of show them your argument is inherently extremist, it's very rhetorically powerful. In this case, he went the other route though. And like the light bulb goes on and she's like, oh, you're right. I shouldn't be against any abortions. Okay, well, I've got to go to class. Goodbye. And she walked away briskly. And I'm like, wait, I wasn't finished. You know, that kind of thing. Now, Jacob on our staff, one of my favorite people in the world, was watching this conversation. And he was like, wait a minute. Did you just make her more pro-choice? Was that a win? And he was really upset. He was like yelling. He was like, that's the worst conversation I've ever seen in my life. He was like really animated. So our staff talked about this on our van ride home that day, about the question of whether or not that girl was better off for having met me, basically. And we came to the conclusion, took us a while to convince Jacob, but the rest of us definitely came to the conclusion that she was better off, and here's why. And this is the thesis of that article. She walked up to our table with an inconsistent but comfortable pro-choice position. She had to walk away from my table with a consistent but very uncomfortable pro-choice position. That's a win. She had to bite the bullet, and something that my brother once said, he said, if people bite the bullet, I want them to bite like an explosive round. I want it to like be really as uncomfortable as possible, because we want them to see they shouldn't be doing that. So we don't want to bite a little bullet, like a BB. We want to bite like a big 50 caliber, you know, like a really, oh man. I want her walking away like, I had to say that to win, like that's not good. Like that's the experience I want her having as she's walking to class. And I think that happened. And I think she's better off for it, even though she was too stubborn to change her mind in that day. So if someone brings up bodily rights arguments, I want you to help them to see that their argument is necessarily an extremist one, in the sense that all abortions ought to be legal if that view is true. And you can read the article to kind of master that if that went too fast for you. And the final point I'll bring up that is often helpful is to talk about the idea of responsibility. So it's like some of you have heard pro-choice people bring up the thought experiment about a violinist, where it's like you're kidnapped and you're hooked up to some other person, and you have to stay hooked up to them for like 9 months. And I've got a lot to say about that argument, but one of the biggest problems with it is there's a thing about the thought experiment that is not parallel to how pregnancy usually begins. You're kidnapped and hooked up to someone. That's not how pregnancy usually begins, okay? It's the worst case scenario of how pregnancy begins. And so the responsibility objection says that when you have consensual sex, you're engaging in an act that you know might result in the creation of an inherently needy child that you now owe compensation to. So like imagine the idea, here's a weird thought experiment, but it's a pro-life one. Imagine a room with a baby making machine in it. Looks like a Coke machine. There's a big round button. If you push that button, you get a very pleasurable experience. Every once in a while though, there's a chute at the bottom, and every once in a while a baby comes out that chute, like a fully formed newborn baby. You all tracking with me? We've simplified pregnancy. Okay, so this guy walks up to the baby making machine. He wants a pleasurable experience. He does not want a baby to come out. So he's rolling the dice, you know, from his perspective. He pushes the button, and wouldn't you know, a baby comes out the chute. Now, when I tell this story to pro-choice people, most of them agree that that guy can't just walk away and leave the baby to starve to death. And it's even more obvious that he can't directly kill it by like bashing his brains in, right? Why? Well, it seems really obvious that this is an important thing. It's morally relevant that he pushed the button. He's the reason this baby's here. In other words, he engaged in an act that he knew might result in the creation of an inherently needy child that he now owes compensation to, which means he needs to either care for this child that he's created or transfer that care to someone else, like adoption. That's fine, but you can't just kill it. It matters that he pushed the button. Is there anything else I'm like thinking about? Like, is there anything else I feel like I need to say about that? So let me say one quick thing. Remember 2 days ago, I talked about the important dialogue tip of saying what you don't mean. If you're going to make this argument, we're going to go advanced here. It's really important for you to explain that you are not making an anti-sex argument. Okay? Like, I don't know what all your religious views are on this call. I'm sure a bunch of you think premarital sex is wrong and people shouldn't do it. And maybe not all of you, and that's fine. Different people are going to have different views about that. But a lot of pro-choice people think that the real reason people are pro-life has nothing to do with babies. What it is we're a bunch of prudes that are freaking out that they're having bad premarital sex. And we want women to get punished for that sex with a baby and going through childbirth. And maybe that'll teach her a lesson. That is that is not a straw man. One of my best pro-choice friends right now recently asked me if that's what was going on. And he's smart, okay? Like, that's a common view. So try to put yourself in their shoes. If you already think that's what's going on with pro-lifers, and then you hear this argument about, well, here's the thing, there's this morally relevant thing that happens when you have consensual sex. You see how you could kind of hear it as in like an anti-sex kind of religious argument? So we just got to help them understand that's not what we're saying. This is not about, like, I'm sorry, I don't lie awake at night freaking out that people are having sex inside a marriage. I'm just not. I don't expect Christians to act, no, I'm sorry, I don't expect non-Christians to act like Christians. Like, whatever, like, this happening. I don't think it's good for them, but I'm not, oh my gosh, like, I'm not like losing sleep over it. That's not what's, I actually think abortion kills babies. I think that's really wrong. I think it's one of the great human rights injustices of our time, and I think I'm good at fighting it, and so that's what I'm doing with my life. That's really honestly what's going on. You can hook me up to a lie detector test, and that's what it is. It's not anything more covert or malicious than that. And so I think it's helpful if you're going to make this argument to just explain, like, this is not an anti-sex thing. This is not like a slut-shaming argument or something like that. I don't care. I'm just saying, if you do choose to do that thing, that I think it is morally relevant, that, like, you know, a baby might be the result of this. And I don't think you get to kill the baby to kind of like resolve the consequences of that. Okay, there's a lot more that I could say on this, but I'm not. I'm going to control myself. We have a landing page on our website. If you go to equalrightsinstitute.com/bodily rights, I made a landing page with a bunch of links to our resources on bodily rights arguments. The most thorough thing that we have is part of the Equipped for Life course. And so if you really want to learn more about it, you should totally get the Equipped for Life course. But if you want some free stuff that'll at least help even more than what I just did, we have some videos and some articles that we will link to. Okay, let's do one more and then jump to Q&A. Let's talk about back alley abortions. I brought this up before. A lot of people, the arguments they're making don't actually talk about either of those two disagreements. They're not saying the words out of person. They're not really arguing from bodily autonomy. They're just talking about, like, what will the consequences be if you pro-lifers get your way in making abortion illegal? And maybe the most common one is women are going to die in dangerous illegal abortions. So we just put out a podcast, a really good podcast on this. I think it's episode 50. And so you're going to want to listen to that if you want more than what I'm going to do. I'm just going to give you a couple of the main points. There's two pieces of common ground you want to find with someone who brings up back alley abortions. The first thing you want to say is, I think it would be truly tragic for anybody to die in an abortion. We ought to mourn needless deaths. This is something that I learned from Steve Wagner at Justice for All. I think it's really important. I think it would be truly tragic for anyone to die in an abortion. We ought to mourn needless deaths. Then there's a second piece of common ground that you ought to find, that you maybe don't want to find this one, but I'm going to recommend that you do. I think that you should grant that if abortion becomes illegal, some abortions will still happen and in more dangerous ways. I think it's probably true that if abortion ever did become illegal, like at a large scale, not just in a few states, but like in most of the states, then I think chemical abortions are what are going to be used for the most part. I don't think we're going back to illegal abortion clinics, and I certainly don't think women are going to be putting up with coat hangers or something like that. And that wasn't going on that often before Roe versus Wade, by the way. I get into that in the podcast. But it will happen illegally, and it is, and as a lot of you know, if you've been following Oregon Right to Life, they've been really good at communicating about how, like, RU46 is not a super safe combination of pills to take. It causes your blood to thin and to not coagulate, and a lot of women have been really hurt through blood loss. Several women have even died. There was one woman in England who lost literally 50% of her blood because she had a bad reaction to RU46. not saying that happens all the time, but that can happen, and you don't want to be, I just don't, I guess, it's way not safe to be doing that and not have access to, medical care if you're going to need medical care. Having said that, I don't think it's a useful thing, like it's not a good use of my time in the beginning of this part of the conversation to argue with them about whether or not illegal abortions are going to happen and how safe they will be. I would rather get to the main point, the real point. So I'm going to grant, okay, I believe that if abortion did become illegal, I do think that some abortions would still happen. You never make any terrible thing down to zero, even by making it illegal. This is true across the board. So I agree it would probably still happen. I think it wouldn't happen a lot. I think it would go down by at least 90%. I've got reasons for that. But I do think it would happen. I do think it would be more dangerous. And yet I still think it should be illegal. And they're probably going to wonder why, because I am granting their view, or at least part of it. I have said I think it will happen less often. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to make that same extremist point as I talked about before. This is an extremist argument. If the argument is that if abortion becomes illegal, women are going to have dangerous versions of it, well, then you can't make late-term abortions illegal, because what if you make late-term abortions illegal and then the women who want late-term abortions decide to do it in a dangerous place? Well, then we can't make any abortions illegal. It's an extremist argument. But I also think, I really like this set of questions that my brother posed one time. He said, do you think, like I do, that abortion is an unjust act of violence against an innocent person? Because if you don't, that's okay, and we should talk about that. But I do, and so it affects the way that I think about these questions. Can you think of one other example where we should keep an unjust act of violence legal to make it safer for a perpetrator to do it anyway? I think that is a very helpful, it kind of helps them understand, here's why we disagree. And because I think it's an unjust act of violence, I don't think we should make it legal even if it is dangerous. Can you think of a time where we should, where that is the right way to think about this? And there's a lot more that I could say, but go listen to the podcast for that. Why don't we stop here and do Q&A? I can do the other, like I've got another one kind of queued up if we run out of questions, but I'm curious, let's see how we're doing on questions. And let's take as many as we have.
Oh, I was going to say, we don't actually have any questions.
Oh, well, I'm just going to keep going then. Okay, well, I'm going to do one more.
I do have one. So we'll do this one, and then you should keep going. I'll check my email too, but I checked it just a couple minutes ago. Okay. So, this is from our friend Donald. Did I miss your response regarding bodily autonomy? What is your response when a woman believes that abortion on demand for any reason up until birth should be legal and is morally okay?
So is the question like, what if she does bite the bullet and says, yep, I think all abortion should be legal?
Yeah, and doesn't walk away.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like, oh no, I mean, at that point I would have treated her like someone who bites the bullet. And would have been like, you really think that all abortions ought to be legal? Like that's a pretty unusual view. Like most people agree that at least like you think like 9-month abortions. I'm not saying that happens all the time. It doesn't. But I'm saying like, what if someone did want to have one, and for a flippant reason? You really think that we should? Like, I would show pictures of what babies in the womb look like at that point. I would try to get her permission to show her a graphic image of a late-term abortion that's in our brochure, because if she's defending that, I think that she ought to see what she's defending, but we only show graphic images with consent. And then I would try other things. I've got other responses to bodily rights arguments that I didn't do because for time. So check out other resources. But we could, in her case, I would have asked about thalidomide next, and there's a couple of different thought experiments relating to a drug called thalidomide that we asked. And I would have seen if I could have found common ground with her there. Because sometimes we get people who bite the first bullet about extremism, but can't bite both of our thalidomide bullets. So that certainly would have been my next move. I don't think I should probably take the time to explain exactly how that argument works at the moment, though. So
Josh, do you have that? Do you have that in a link that I need to?
Yeah. So one of the links.
Quite a list, you guys.
Yes, one of the links on the bodily rights landing page is an article called "Autumn in the Sovereign Zone," And in that one, we have like 5 responses to this certain type of bodily rights argument, and the second and third one have to do with thalidomide. There's one on there we don't use anymore that relates to an art student from Yale. So it's a pretty old article. So we just use the other 4. And I'll just warn you, the last part of the thought experiment is a pretty grisly article. And so just kind of know that. But once you get into where you're really having these philosophical conversations about abortion, I think sometimes your thought experiment has to be grisly because abortion is grisly. And we want to help them to see that, even if they won't let us show them graphic pictures. So just kind of know it's a rough article to read, but it is very, very powerful.
Josh, do you think you could speak to why you only show graphic images with consent?
Yeah.
Lois, do you have something you wanted to cover on that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I was just going to make a comment.
Yeah, this is like one of the most loaded questions I ever get asked. Thanks, Liberty. It's like, I mean, like the pro-life movement's a really divided place, and this is one of the big ones. There's a lot of pro-life people are very passionate about how to do outreach, and so we have an article that Liberty can link to that goes into this a little bit called "Abortion Images: A Case for Disagreement Without Division," that Tim and I wrote together a long time ago. And we don't get into like all of our reasons, but we get into at least kind of what we do. What we do at an outreach as this is we have graphic images. We have very graphic images in our brochure, but we use them with consent only. The reason is because I've tried everything and I found this to work the best. There are not very many pro-life activists who's done a lot of both non-graphic and graphic outreach. Because typically if you're really passionate about graphic images, you tend to want to always use them because you want your outreach to be as effective as possible, right? You want to expose the truth of what abortion is, even if people are walking by and don't talk to you. And then you got some other people on the other side of the spectrum that are like very opposed to graphic images, so they never want to be around those. And I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of both kinds of outreach, as well as my team, or most members of my team. And I've come to believe that graphic signs are less effective now than they used to be. And some of that, a lot of it comes down to psychology. The way that Gen Z psychologically processes data is just really different than the way Gen X processes data. Truth doesn't change, but culture does. And so I'm paying a lot of attention, and more attention now. I just think it's fascinating. We've been so into philosophy, and now I'm getting more into psychology, because a lot of persuasion is psychological, not just philosophical. It has to do like the way, like people are emotional, messy creatures. This one kid at the Students for Life conference a couple of years ago, he pulls me aside and he says, "So do you change 100% of the minds, like the people that you talk to?" And I was like, "No." And he's like, "So like 99%?" I was like, "No, dude, not even 50. Like, people are not robots. If people were super logical robots and I had enough time with all of them, I think I could get them all to be pro-life. I think we do have the best arguments. But people are not primarily logical creatures. We all have confirmation bias and a lot of experiences and baggage and the people that we know, like all kinds of things that are going on that are make it hard for us to change our mind about something. So why did I bring that up? So what we have, so psychology. I'm trying to figure out, how do you take someone who is emotional and closed to your view when they come up and change their mind the most often? And what I have found is not starting with graphic images means a lot more of them are going to feel kind of emotionally safe to talk to me. And as they talk to me, they're going to see that I'm a very different pro-lifer than they probably expected, as well as like my team or whoever they're talking to. If they're talking with Oregon Right to Life staff, like they're going to see the same thing, or JFA staff. It's not just us. And then what I'm doing is, it goes back to that motto: every conversation is a series of difficult judgment calls and missed prayer without ceasing. I'm trying to figure out, is this a person that would be helped by seeing a graphic image today? And this is probably one of the areas where I disagree with the people who use graphic signs more, is they typically think that every single person who sees a graphic image is helped every time. And I just disagree. I think there's some people that maybe they were recently post-abortive, or they're particularly closed, or like something else is going on where it actually makes them further from being open to the pro-life view. But that's not always the truth. It's like, this is complicated. There are some people, and I've seen it, every one of our staff members has seen people change their mind at an instant because of a graphic picture, which makes this complicated. It's not like they're all bad or something like that. They're really, really important evidence. And I just think it's important to get them, I want them to see the image. If you really want to get down to it, here's what it is. I want them to truly see the image. And if I get their permission and say, I want to make sure we're both talking about the same thing. Can I show you a non-photoshopped real image of an abortion at the stage that we're talking about? And just make sure we're on the same page. Most of them say yes. They don't want to be like, oh no, I don't want to be exposed to the truth. Like they're gonna see it. But the fact that I've been so respectful of them that I've asked their permission means that then when I open it up, they stare. They don't just like turn away or flip me off and run away. They stare at it. And one of the hardest little moves that we have to make there is to not break the silence. Because I am uncomfortable. No one likes long periods of silence. That's why I say all the time, right? It's just like, that's like the thing, like we don't like silence. But this is a point where they really they might need 20 seconds to look at what they're seeing, and they see it. And it gets in at a level that a lot of times I don't think happens when they're on a big sign. And so I love a lot of the people that are using abortion signs. Some of my best friends in the pro-life movement use big abortion signs, and I don't think they're stupid or bad or mean or overly aggressive or something like that. I mean, some are, but like that's true at every group has their kind of elements that are a little bit hard. But I don't think it's usually going on. I think it's just we think differently about psychology and what is most persuasive with current young people. And so this is what we've found to be to be what works best. We've got some data behind it. If I came to believe differently, or if culture changes again, I will happily put graphic images back on signs and take them to our outreaches.
So what if the argument becomes personal, as in the woman shares she had an abortion and does not regret it?
Yeah, I've got an article on that on poor Liberty. It's like my hand hurts. What if a woman says she's happy she had an abortion? Is the article. And it's so long ago that I read it. I don't remember exactly what it says. So I was gonna like improvise. Like I would. Here's what I'm not gonna do. I'm not gonna be like, ew, oh, what's wrong with you? Like that kind of. Don't you know what abortion is? Like I'm not gonna act like that. I think I'm going to do something like I'm going to thank her for sharing that with me, because I think in a certain sense, well, I'm going to at least treat it like she's honoring me with that information. She might not be. She might be using it as a weapon. But either way, I'm just going to treat it like, oh, well, thank you for being willing to share that with me. I know that's deeply personal. And I'm sorry. I imagine that was a really hard time in your life. And I'm sorry to hear that. And I would ask her if there's anything, I learned this from Jacob, this is in our self-counseling masterclass. Is there anything that she would like me to know as someone who personally has had an abortion and as someone who has not personally gone through the experience? Is there any information that she would like me to know that she thinks maybe I don't know? And I would invite her to share whatever she would like to share. I would say, you don't have to share anything. If you're not comfortable, totally fine. But if you would like, I will truly listen to you with very open ears, whatever you want to tell me about that experience. So that's one thing I'm going to do. A couple other things I'm going to do. This is probably more than what's in the article. So I've learned more things. So I'm going to, so there's kind of a tricky thing a tricksy thing that Jacob does, where he will say, you might not regret your abortion, but just in case you end up coming to know someone who does, I just want you to know that there are a lot of resources out there for women who regret their abortion. It is at least common for women to eventually, not usually right away, but maybe years and years later, to eventually go through some pretty significant depression from that. And I just don't want people going through that. I just want you to know that there are resources out there. In fact, I know of this pregnancy center locally that does that for free. And so I just want you to know that, not for you, just for anyone that you know. And that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm really saying is I want you to know, if you ever are starting to feel guilty, I want you to know these things are. But we kind of we say it in this way that is going to just be less off-putting to her. I don't want to make her feel defensive. So that's the thing that I'll say. And then the last thing, what was the other thing I had in my head? Oh, so if we've gone through that, and it seems to me like she is still willing to have like a philosophical moral debate, then I have a direction that I will go. But I will not always go here. It is a mistake to be like no matter what the person says, I'm going to try to make sure I make my favorite argument. Like there are just some people that are not ready for it. It's the wrong time. And you want to wait till they're ready and open. But if she's like still there, she's open, then the direction I'm going to go is, okay, so going back to what you first said, you kind of said, I've had an abortion and I don't regret it at all. And I think maybe you are misunderstanding my primary argument. And it wouldn't surprise me, because frankly, a lot of pro-life people do kind of imply the thing that you're saying, which is that abortion is wrong because a lot of women regret their abortion. And I just don't think that's a good argument. I think there are all kinds of things that people regret that should be legal. Like the fact that you regret or don't regret your abortion, I think really doesn't prove anything. Outside of it says something arguably about your personal experience. And there's a pretty big spectrum of people having like what their experience of abortion is. Obviously, you're somewhere on that spectrum. But I'm arguing that abortion unjustifiably kills a human person, and that women's bodily autonomy, although important, doesn't give them the right to directly kill that person. And so I just don't think that your feelings about your personal abortion do anything, like they don't attack my argument. They attack a different argument and a common one, but I'm with you. I'll join you on that fight. That's a bad argument. Abortion's not wrong because it makes women sad. It's something wrong about abortion. It's like not a good thing that a lot of women are sad after abortion, but that doesn't prove it to be illegal. I'm making a different argument. So like, help me understand why my argument is bad. And I would invite them to do that. But if they're super emotional and freaking out at me, like in this, like we're not going to be able to get to that point, then I will be comfortable with, like at the end of the time that we had, not having gotten to that because I made the right judgment call for her. Some people are not ready for the whole kit and caboodle in that day. So I want to be as loving to them. What do they need from me today? And how far can I get with them? And sometimes it's not very far, and that's okay because I was so loving that I was willing to hold back and try to be as helpful as I could to them in that day.
I like that.
Sorry.
I think it's a really important point you made about clarifying that the reason why we are out wherever we are, the reason why we think abortion is wrong is not how people feel about it, and that includes a woman who's had an abortion. And I think that because we can kind of fall into that trap of look, women suffer all of these consequences from abortions, and that is bad, and it's damaging to women. But that's an outcome of something that's already morally wrong. And it's a violation of human rights. So I like that. Okay, so I do have
I wasn't done yet.
Something. What?
I wanted to follow up on what Josh said too.
Yeah.
I really think it can't be like overstated, the need to hold ourselves back sometimes, especially if we are doing the work like all of us are doing by attending these calls and reading Josh's articles and podcasts and those type of things. Like we have so much more information than the average person has around this topic, even though the average person does have a lot of emotion and feels very strongly about this topic, they may not actually have a lot of logic to back it up. And I think it's really important that we don't feel like we are their only opportunity to hear the truth about this topic, and so we have to say everything we can in the tiniest little fraction of the time that we have with them, because that just makes people feel steamrolled, and they also are going to be less likely to engage on this conversation with people outside of their. Josh talked about it earlier in this week about like basically how so many people are in echo chambers now, where they're just listening to people that think the way that they think. And if you have an opportunity to break into somebody's echo chamber and share something different, do it really carefully and cautiously so they don't like brick up the walls even higher. And they're like, well, I'm never having another conversation with somebody that's opposes abortion because it went so terribly and they didn't listen to me and they just preached at me the entire time. So I think that that's really important to remember.
I do have another question. This is kind of interesting. So in regard to bodily autonomy, do you ever bring the man into the discussion, the father, I'm assuming, as someone who has a property interest? Does the influence of the man who might be persuaded to agree with you have strategic potential to change the woman's mind?
I don't think so. I think most female pro-choice advocates would be put off by an argument that relates to like men's rights in that area. I think that's more of an argument that is appealing to pro-life people. So when in 1991, when Casey versus Planned Parenthood happened, this is kind of one of the major Supreme Court decisions. One of the things that they were doing was they were analyzing like 5 different like pro-life incremental laws. There's like informed consent and like waiting periods and parental notification. And one of them was a spousal notification. A few states had passed a spousal notification bill where you have to notify the spouse before she can have the abortion. It wasn't consent, but it was a notification. And there was I think there's like a late term ban. And basically the Supreme Court said that 4 out of 5 of those laws are fine. You can do 4 out of 5 of those, but you cannot do spousal notification bills. That was the one that they crossed out. So sometimes pro-lifers talk about that and are like, man, it is just so messed up that women can just go and have this abortion. And maybe it's really, really, really sad for the husband or for the boyfriend or whatever. And I think that's true. Like, I pity the man who is wrecked, emotionally wrecked, when he finds out that his wife or his girlfriend had an abortion. He never even knew she was pregnant. And he would have been like, I want to support you. Let's get married. I want to do the right thing. This is a child. Like those people exist. And that's really, really sad. But pro-choice people are not sad about the fact that they don't have to tell boyfriends or husbands, potentially abusive husbands, about the abortion. So, I mean, feminism is a pretty real factor on college campuses right now. And so I am choosing different arguments for primarily pragmatic reasons. But sorry if I just straw man like like maybe that person asking had something better in their mind than what I just reacted to. But
I know, maybe let's just chat. Maybe you address, do you talk about adoption when you're in your arguments? Let's broaden it a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is an area where I have changed my mind recently. So, I mean, I never talked about adoption a lot in my dialogues, especially because a lot of my dialogues we're talking about whether abortion is right or wrong. And so, like, I think a lot of pro-life people think that, like, so there's like this bumper sticker. It's like, adoption, the better option, or the nicer option, or the more loving option, or something like that. And it seems just like this really easy solution. Like, duh, we have a third. You don't even have to have the baby for 18 years. Just give birth and give it to someone else. Like, it's as simple as that. And it's just not for pro-choice people, especially women who maybe don't want to go through 9 months of pregnancy and childbirth, and then not keep the baby. Like, that's really emotionally painful to a lot of people. Or living with the my child is out there somewhere, and I don't know if he or she is being abused. I don't know if he or she is going to come looking for me at some point, even whether it's a closed or open adoption. Like, this is really, really difficult. And so I think pro-life people probably tend to make the mistake of overemphasizing adoption and not de-emphasizing it. The one time that I do talk about adoption, well, probably the one time, but the main time is when pro-choice people bring up foster care, or like this idea that like adopted kids get abused all the time. Pro-choice people think that newborn adoption and foster care are the same thing a lot. And so I sometimes have to do this quick like fact check thing where I explain how they're two different categories. Foster care is when the government takes the kids forcibly out of their home because of abuse, or maybe they're selling drugs out of the house, or it's dangerous or something like that. And then typically those parents get a lot of chances to get their kid back, arguably sometimes too many chances in spite of abuse. Newborn adoption is like the mom knew she's not keeping this baby and is voluntarily signed away the rights to this child. And those are two very different things. And in foster care, abuse does happen sometimes, not always, not as much as even people think, but it does happen sometimes because the government, because we want to not have kids stuck in the foster care system, we want kids getting to living in as stable homes as possible, we will give the family who takes care of this kid a check every month. So some people will take on not one kid, but 4 or 5 or 6 kids to get a check for every one of those, and are maybe not taking the best care of those kids. It might be more financially motivated than selfless. And so abuse sometimes happens there. Whereas newborn adoption, you're going to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to adopt this baby, probably after years of infertility. And I don't think abuse happens as often in those cases. So I will talk about it there. Here's the area where I've changed my mind recently. It's really interesting. We need to do like a podcast correction or something, but I'll explain here. So we did a recent podcast that Liberty can link to. I don't remember what it's called, but it had Jacob on it. It's the most recent one with Jacob on it with me. But no, there's Jacob and Rachel. They're talking about sidewalk counseling. They're kind of promoting the sidewalk counseling course and answering some
comments. Are you going to email this to me if you don't remember the name?
I can find it real quick. But
like go listen to all my podcasts, find the one that I'm referring to vaguely and put it in the list.
Yeah, I know. I'm being very vague. I can pull it up real fast. But it was this thing we recorded it like last year. It just took us forever to like get around to editing it and putting it out. And so we were answering basically some common questions about sidewalk counseling and trying to demonstrate that Jacob really knows what he's talking about and use it by our course. This is a lot of our podcast. And so they talked about adoption for a while because new sidewalk counselors tend to really want to talk about adoption a lot. In fact, that'll be a lot of times what the sign is, like, we will adopt your baby, or adoption's a loving option, or whatever. And he was really saying, like, that's not one of the better signs. And it's off-putting to a lot of women, ironically, who are wanting to have an abortion, or weirdly, like, it doesn't seem like it would be, but for them, it's like too soon. If you get into the adoption conversation during your first conversation with someone you're trying to convince not to have an abortion, it's just so soon. Sometimes they react super weirdly, like in this, like, what are you trying to take my baby? Like, you want to steal my baby? Like, why do you want this baby? Like this kind of, they have this weird reaction sometimes. And so it doesn't work as well. Hang on. It is why sidewalk counselors should not recommend adoption. There you go. It's right there in the title. I picked the most controversial thing we talked about and made that the title. It's, I don't know. It's like episode 43, 42, something like that.
Okay, I got it.
So here's what's interesting. Like, I thought by putting that podcast out, I promise I'm wrapping up the thing. But I thought we were putting this thing out that was going to, like, we're going to get a lot of hate mail. Because I get so much, like, hate mail is a little bit of a strong term, but I get a lot more angry messages from pro-lifers than I do pro-choice people. I got one today. And so I was expecting, like, all these people, like, how dare you say that someone, I talk about adoption all the time on abortion clinic sidewalks, and I've saved 3 lives in the last 10 years, or like emails like that. And I didn't get any complaints except one. from a woman who said, I think you guys emphasize talking about adoption too strongly. And I was like, what? We were talking about not talking about it. But she said, yeah, but there's this one little bit where Jacob mentioned talking about it like ever, like at all. And she said, I think that's too often. And I realized like I just kind of missed it. It happened fast. It was my bad as I'm the one who edited the podcast. And I just kind of missed it. And Jacob wasn't being super crystal clear. And Sierra's like, no, you made the other mistake. You still talked about doing it too much. And it was like, yeah, actually, now that you say that, I think you're right about that. And so at some point, I'm going to have her on the podcast, and we'll talk about that. So, yeah, very rarely do I think it's persuasive for pro-life people to talk about adoption unless they think that all adopted kids are abused or something like that. Then I'll talk about it. For the most part, especially self-counseling, don't get into adoption. Not in that day. Like maybe if they decide to go to the pregnancy center, and they have their ultrasound, and they stay in touch with you, and they say, I'm not going to have this abortion. I think I can make it. Like maybe if you know she's in really, really a bad situation, maybe then it's okay to talk about. But I think the argument that's driving me that a lot of people will disagree with is I think that generally speaking, women should keep the baby more often than probably most pro-lifers think. I think adoption can cause more harm to the average kid than most people think. And it would be better for us to gently push people to try to make it work, as opposed to instantly, no matter what's going on in your life, definitely give it to someone else.
That's really true from a psychological therapist, trauma perspective. Anytime that a child is separated from biological parents, even if it's an abusive situation, is a traumatic experience the child has to heal from. So it's
better than killing them. I get it. It is better than killing them.
But I think it's just we're learning more than we ever have about developmental trauma and adverse childhood effects and things like that. And it's really important for us to take into account. But Josh, it is past noon and people are needing to go eat lunch. So okay. I don't want to cut you off because you're amazing. I do want to plug the fact that Josh is coming to our conference in what day is it, Lois? Is it March 6th?
March 6th.
Because we are going to hope that next year is not a repeat of this year, although there's been so many amazing things that we've all done and lots of personal growth and all sorts of good things in the challenges, but it's been hard. Josh, I just want to thank you again so much. Lois has been recording this. It's on me to get it up. I'm telling you, it's not going to get up this week. Next week, we're going to put it on YouTube.
One last parting thought is something that Josh said on his first day was part of our task is to bring nuance into an argument that has become so black and white. And it's not to be wussy. It's to be in the situation where we can share the truth in the most impactful way. And I have really thought about that. I think it's really important. We're having dialogue with individual people who we want to change their mind about abortion. We want them not to have abortions, and nuance is a very important part of that. And it is difficult to be nuanced in our culture today. So that was just my parting thought. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Josh, for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it.